We're in the Gospel of John. We're going to start something new today. So many of you will be familiar with the Gospel of John or the other Gospels perhaps. This is the first time for us as a church family to study one of the Gospels, so I'm really excited about it. Now, if you are familiar with the Gospels at all, you know that John's Gospel is unique. It's different than the other three. One of these things is not like the others. It stands out in a number of ways, and I think that's intentional. John is structured differently. He has the same story. He has the same people, the same actors, if you will, but he has some different events that aren't included in the other Gospels and some different teachings. He structures his story differently. And he uses different language. Now, if you're familiar with this, the New Testament was all written in Greek, so it is in Greek, but there's a different vocabulary, and the language is shaped differently to get to certain things. The Gospel of John is often considered one of the hardest of the four to read and comprehend. And as I was thinking again about this gospel this week, I felt like, yes, that definitely is true. And it's also fantastic to share with new Christians or people who don't know anything at all about the Bible. It's great for evangelism, and that's the purpose of why he wrote it and the Spirit inspired it, so that you might believe. So we're going to dive in. And if you have a Bible, I would encourage you to open and turn there to John chapter 1. If you haven't, we have some behind there we'd love to loan out, or grab a smartphone app and follow along if you'd like. John is dense, yet it's spiritually alive. My own experience as a new Christian, I can remember this as I coming to faith in college as a new believer, and then going home for that summer, and someone gave me a book, and it was kind of like, hey, here's like 101 for becoming a Christian, and it had different verses listed, and I would go look up the verses, and I finally got bored with the book, and I just stayed with the verses, and I got stuck in John's Gospel, and I can remember that summer as a new believer holding it, and I kept catching myself like, I'm getting stiff. Like, oh, wait, the story had so engrossed me that I literally kept getting closer and closer with my face to the page. My goal for us these next few weeks as we study select parts of this gospel in preparation for Easter is that you would get pulled into the story. That John's writing, though we don't talk like this, and it's different from the other texts we read, my goal for us all is that it would pull us into the story, and that's been my prayer for us this week. So let's take a look at it. John chapter 1. I'll read the first few verses. Again, it would work best if you're able to follow along somehow. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So if you're familiar with the other Gospels, and we often go to the other Gospel stories at Christmas time, right? Where do we start out? We start out with the beginning of Jesus. We start out with the stories of Jesus' birth and how he was prophesied he'd come, and Mary visited by an angel, and miraculous conception, and Jesus is born in the manger, and the barn and the nativity scenes and all that. John starts out in a very different place. This huge, towering language here. As I was thinking about this, I'm kind of a nerd in this, but But the thing that struck me, this is like that high note at the beginning of the Star Wars scroll. Okay, you're sitting in the middle of the theater and it's black, and all of a sudden this huge trumpet, and if you don't know what it's coming, you kind of jump. That's how John starts out. Just boom, got your attention. In the beginning was the Word. We're starting out soaring. We're not easing into this. He comes to this huge, sweeping story. Really, really unique language. John's gospel starts out with what's called a prologue. He kind of summarizes and overviews the whole gospel in these first 18 verses. And so these first few lines, as you read it, it's poetic, but it's also simplistic and yet profound. It's sweeping and all-encompassing, but it's also pointed and specific. So what is the writer doing here? Why this unique language? There's probably a lot of reasons, but here's, I think, one. Here's where I'll hang my hat on it. He's trying to show that his subject is unique. That isn't to say the other gospel writers are wrong, but John is doing something different. Why this strange kind of poetic introduction, this huge, all the concert hits one high note to get everybody's attention at the beginning of the piece? Because the subject demands it. Now look at the word here. He is trying to show us in this high and exalted and sweeping language that what he's talking about is high and exalted and sweeping. Maybe you caught the first reference. In the beginning was the Word. If you're familiar with the Bible story at all, that should ring a bell for you. It's the same words that the first book of the Bible begins. In the beginning, God, in Genesis chapter 1. In fact, in the Greek text of both, it sounds almost the same. There's a parallel here, and he's intimating. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And what John is saying here is, in the beginning, the Word. The Word is in the place of God. There's an intentional parallel here that he's trying to say. So right off the bat, there's this huge scope that he's involved us in, and he's drawn us in. And he's tied it to other themes that would have been familiar. In the beginning was the words. Now, those lines from Genesis 1, are some of the most pregnant lines in the entire Bible. So all things, as we know it, had a beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So heavens and the earth and everything we see, it's a merism, it's a Hebrew figure of speech. All of it's included. Everything was created by God, which means that God existed on His own before all of those things had their beginning. So what John, the writer of this gospel, is trying to say here is that the Word, this personality that he refers to as the Word, was pre-existent with and equal to God. So in the beginning, God. So if there was a beginning, God was outside of it and acted upon. Aristotle's unmoved mover, right? God was outside the beginning. The Word was also before the beginning. So if you think in terms of literature, the reference here is an allusion to Genesis. But in history, the Word precedes Genesis. He comes before it. He's already there. He was already present when Genesis 1 actually transpired. The Word was with God in eternity past. He was with Him, but yet He was separate and distinct. And the Word was God. though separate, the Word was the same as God. Not equal to God, but also God. Are you confused yet? Now notice that he's referred to as He. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. Verse 2, He was in the beginning with God. That's a personal pronoun. There's not just some nebulous philosophy or abstract concept here. So who is the He? Let's keep reading. He says, all things, verse 3, were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. And in Him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So John, the gospel writer, is telling us both positively and negatively that this person called the Word was the agent of creation. So when we read in Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth. We're told now that the way God did it was through the Word. Everything that was made through Him. And then stated negatively, there's nothing that has been made that wasn't made through Him. So if you're a theology nerd, and I know a few of you are, because I've spoken with you, okay? That discounts the idea that Jesus was the first created thing. And there are some heresies that claim to be Christian that will make that case. Nothing exists. Nothing created exists that was not made through the Word. So why the cryptic language, John? Why this thing about the Word? Why not just call Him Jesus? I mean, we kind of know that's where the story's going, all right? We know enough to know that that's who he's talking about. He's talking about Jesus. Why not just say it? Why this symbolic language and this use of the Word? Why go to this lengths to... Are you being intentionally obscure here, John? What are you doing? So the word here for word is the Greek word logos, and it has a lot of meaning loaded behind it. We're not going to unpack everything. It literally means word, but it's distinguished in the Greek language. There's another word that you could use for word. There's the Greek word rhema and the Greek word logos, okay? So if you use the word rhema, it would mean sound or utterances. It'd be kind of like, when your cell phone goes a little fritzy and you're like, I can hear words. I can't make out what the conversation is saying, but I can hear this double thing going on, or you're in a hotel room that's cheap and you can hear words next door, but you can't necessarily make out the conversation. That might be the rhema, okay? The logos is an intelligible, understood word, and it can also mean, it can come to mean an entire message. So, as in you read from the scriptures, hear the word of the Lord. Well, what's the word? It's not one word. It's referring to a message. So why is John using this? Why call him the Logos? Well, he's tying into some ideas from the Greek world to minister, to reach people there, but he's also trying to say something very specific. See, if we jump ahead in the story, we know that Jesus is the Word. What you need to understand is that Jesus Himself is a message. The reason He calls Him the Word, one of the reasons at least, is that Jesus is a message. Jesus is the self-revelation of God. Self as in God is making Himself known. He is revealing Himself to us. Jesus is a message. He's telling us about God. He's showing God. In fact, God is making Himself known in human form. How many of you have heard this idea before? Good. You could raise your hand. I think Most of us, nobody wants to raise their hand. Okay, we need to go back to square one and start over, okay? I know most of us, at some level, have engaged with these ideas. Yeah, God, Jesus is God's Son, came to earth. We celebrate Christmas. We talk about the incarnation. I have become way too comfortable with this language. It should blow me away. This idea that the eternal God who made everything and holds everything in his hands comes to earth to be a man. Those should blow my categories up. I should struggle with that. That is a move on God's part that is so huge and awe-inspiring. It should blow us away that the God, the creator of all things, took the form of his creatures. See, the creatures were made to serve him, and then he comes and takes the form of that very creature to serve them. This is amazing. Don't lose sight of how astounding this is. So if we think of creation as a story, this isn't like a cameo, okay? Like where Peter Jackson puts on a mask and pretends he's an orc in the Battle of Helm's Deep. Nobody just got that right there. This isn't a cameo where the director puts on a costume and is kind of like in the background for just a glimpse of a scene. This is the author of the story getting into and playing a leading role, the leading role. Don't miss how significant this is. The eternal world of the divine condescending to the temporal world of sin. God condescending to reveal himself to us and to give us the gift of himself. John uses the word logos here. He calls Christ the Word, because just like good poetry, it can pack in more. Loaded it all into one word. Secondly, I think his use of the word is a further tie to the chapter of Genesis. If we were to go back and study Genesis, maybe you're familiar with it, maybe you could read it this afternoon. It says that God spoke and creation happened. Things sprung forth from his word. So the word communicates and the word creates. Jesus is the one who made it. He is the word. And the connections to Genesis continue. There's more. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. We have life where the word has the same self-existence that God does. And there's light. Genesis is light and darkness, and he shares that life with humans as though like a flame to a candle or lighting a lamp. More from Genesis. In the same fashion that God breathes life into Adam, Jesus, in him was life. If you don't have Jesus, you don't have life. That's where John will go by the end of his story. And in the same pattern in Genesis, when humans reflect that glory of God as his image bearers. And here humans have been given life by the word, then reflect his light. And like in Genesis where darkness and chaos reign, God speaks in light and brings order. And so in the same way here in this text, it says that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. It's the parallels here are really, really striking. So 6 through 8 continue the imagery of light and darkness. Follow with me as I read the next few verses. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. So verse 6 shifts the focus a little bit. So we move from this huge, where the whole orchestra hits this high note to bang, grab your attention, and then we have that trumpet, Now there was a man sent from God. So we've shifted focus, talking about the Word, we move to a man. He's sent from God. Now the previous person, the Logos, was God, and this guy is lesser. But he's sent by God. So he serves God, in other words, and his name is John. Now, question. Is this the guy that wrote the book then? Is this the guy he's named after? And the answer is no. Because the author of this gospel that bears his name, John, never uses his name. He always calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved, or the other disciple. He doesn't like to name himself. So this person here, who was sent by God, his name is John. We're talking about John the Baptist. So some of you maybe are aware of that. If not, that's just a clarifying point here. So John the Baptist, is introduced as a man, which is a sharp contrast with the first few lines with the Word, who's God and equal to God and eternal with God. This guy is just a man, but he's not an ordinary man. He's sent by God. Now, again, if we have the rest of the biblical story in mind, we know that the people who are sent by God, we have a title for them. We call them prophets. So, John is just a man. Put him in his proper context, but he's not an ordinary man. He's a prophet sent by God. That's a big honor. And he says he was specifically sent to be a witness. Now, there was a man sent from God. His name was John, and he came as a witness to bear witness about the light. Verse 8, he was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. Now, that word, it's martyria or martyrian. There's a noun and a verb form used throughout John's gospel over 40 times. Okay? It's used, I think, 8 times in this chapter alone, or 7 times in this chapter alone. It means to serve as a witness in the noun form, or to give testimony in the verb form. Think of it like a legal context. So the witness, will the witness come forth and tell us what they saw, at the scene that night? John the Baptist is put forward as a witness. Now, there's a reason that it's used 7 times. It's a big word for the writer of this book. He uses it a ton. What he will do, he's making a case, and he's presenting it like a courtroom scene, and he's going to bring forward various witnesses and present them to bear their testimony, and want you, at the end of it, to make a decision. Will you accept the witnesses? And towards that goal, he'll bring forth other witnesses. He'll bring forth 7 signs. If I could do this here. 7. Math is hard. 7 signs to demonstrate the point that Jesus is who he said he is. And then what will the jury decide? That's at the end of it. Okay? So he uses this word a lot, but John the Baptist is the first of these witnesses. John came sent by God. Now look at, he came as a witness, verse 7, to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. So if he's a witness, God sent him to testify. It's for everybody. Everybody should listen. This is a message cosmic in scope. No one excluded, that all might believe through him. Sent from God. So God sends a messenger for everyone, then that means that God is concerned about everyone. There isn't one human soul that this message will not apply to. It's good news for all of us. So John came to bear witness about the light. So I want to jump down to verse 19. This is the testimony. So he came to bear witness. So what's he bearing witness about? Let's hear what he has to say. Verse 19, follow with me if you could, please. And this is the testimony of John. There's our word again. When the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" he confessed and did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" And he said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" And he answered, "No." So they said to him, "Who are you? We need to give an answer to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" And he said, "I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, 'Make straight the way of the Lord,' as the prophet Isaiah said." Now they had been sent from the Pharisees, and they asked him, "Why then are you baptizing if you are neither Christ nor Elijah nor the prophet?" And John answered them, "I baptize with water, but among you stands one you do not know, even he who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I'm not worthy to untie." These things took place in Bethany across the Jordan, where John was baptizing. So this is the testimony. This is the witness. So here it is. This is the official statement from the prophet himself. Now, John downplays his role, despite sharing company with the Old Testament prophets. And here's how he does it. So John is out in the Jordan, the area of the Jordan River, to the east of Jerusalem, where the temple complex and all of the religious leaders were centered. And he's out there baptizing, and he's calling people to repentance. So this gets people's attention. And so the leaders send him out, or send delegates out to talk to him and say, "Well, what are you doing?" You know, they're not necessarily confronting him here, but they're saying, "Well, who are you? Are you the Christ?" Now, what does that mean? The Christ is just the Greek word for Messiah. It means anointed one. It's a Hebrew term. But the Messiah was the one who was prophesied in the Old Testament, who would come and set everything right, and he would judge the enemies of God, and he would exalt Israel, and he was going to make everything good again. He would sit on David's throne, and Israel would be powerful and glorious, and nobody would be disobedient, because the king, the Messiah, would be there to make sure everybody did the right things and didn't displease God anymore. And so John has put himself forward publicly in his ministry and what he says and what he does, and they have rightly gathered this guy's talking about the end of days. So they figured that out. Okay, so we know at the end of days the Messiah is supposed to come. Are you that guy? No, I'm not that guy. I'm not the light. I'm just bearing witness about the light. So then they go to this, okay, all right. So are you Elijah or are you the prophet? So what's that about? That seems to us that's kind of weird. So in this particular time period, there were certain beliefs that the Jewish people held, and it wasn't like everybody believed this exactly. There were some variances here. But they expected a few prophet-type figures to come from God before the Messiah came. One of these would be the prophet Elijah. They got that from the book of Malachi, chapters 3 and 4, the idea that Elijah, the spirit of Elijah would return. And so they're saying, "Are you Elijah?" And he says, "No." Now, it looks like what they were asking is, are you Elijah reincarnated? Because if you're familiar with the story of Elijah, you can go back to 2 Kings. Elijah skipped out on something that you and I will never get to, okay? The two things insured in life, death and taxes. Now, I don't know if Elijah paid his taxes or not, but he didn't die. It says he was walking with another prophet named Elisha, and all of a sudden he was taken up to heaven. Never died. And so the belief was, if he didn't die, he's going to come back from heaven. This is Elijah. And John's answer is no. I'm not Elijah reincarnated. They said, okay, are you the prophet? Well, what world does that mean? They believed from Deuteronomy chapter 18, where Moses said, and you will receive another prophet like me. They believed that this figure would also come from God before the final Messiah came. And so are you one of these figures? He says, no, I'm not that guy. So they're looking in what they conceived of the Scriptures, the way they read it and the way they understood it. They were looking for John the Baptist to fulfill the Scriptures. That's good. But God doesn't always fulfill the Scriptures exactly like we want Him to. And so they said, well, what are you doing then? What would you say about yourself? And he quotes an entirely different passage. Isaiah 40, verse 3, I'm a voice in the wilderness crying out, prepare and get ready for the arrival of God. Okay, all right. They were expecting him to fulfill Scriptures. They were looking, but they were not open for God to define it on His terms. And so he says, I'm not these things. I am here to prepare the way. And so they're confused. And well, why then are you baptizing? Like, well, that's preparing the way. But what you need to understand is my baptism is small. There's somebody coming after me who's so much greater. In fact, he's here now, but you don't know him. And he's so much greater. I'm not even worthy to wash his feet. And the conversation leaves off there. Look at verse 29. So the next day, he, that is John the Baptist, saw Jesus coming toward him, and he said, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is he of whom I said, after me comes a man who ranks before me, because he was before me. This is the testimony. John the Baptist comes as a witness to say, I've been sent by God, and he sees Jesus coming. He says, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This was the guy I was sent about because he precedes me. He was pre-existent. He's always been. He's the one who's greater than I am. And this is the testimony of John. He bears witness. This is big. So, why this phrase? So we've come to this figure, and the writer calls him the Word. There's all this high language and philosophical language and, metaphors and stuff. And then John the Baptist, when he sees him, he introduces him as something different. He says, behold the Lamb of God. Again, take all of our pre-understanding and try to hear that for the first time. Hear it fresh. These were Jewish people who sacrificed a lamb every year at the Passover. They sacrificed lambs at other times of the year. Perhaps it's a picture from Abraham and Isaac on the mount where it says Abraham cryptically prophesies God himself will provide the lamb. And John says, behold, and that's a word that means like, hey, wake up, pay attention. We don't speak like that today, unless you're like to just talk in King James English maybe. We don't really use that language. It's like, hey, pay attention. That's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. So he puts this huge figure who is before him. It's very important. He calls him a lamb, and he says he takes away the sin of the world. Now, it would be one thing to say, hey, there's the guy who's going to take away the sin of the world. Oh, I can see how the Messiah is going to do. He's going to take it away. He's going to make everybody obey, and nobody will sin anymore. But he doesn't just say, that's the powerful guy who's going to take away the sin of the world. He says, there's the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. The Lamb sent by God. This is the testimony of John. How's he going to do that? Why is he the Lamb? He's a person. The Old Testament says that God abhorred human sacrifice. Where's this story going to go? You see, we're invited in the very first line to imagine it. In starting with the beginning, the author has invited us to wonder about the end. Where does this story go? There's a reason he's using this poetic language. In the beginning was the Word. Where does the story end then? We're invited into it. We're invited to come in and see it. He's already told us that the Lamb will take away the sin of the world. How is that going to happen? Ponder that today as we think about preparing for Easter. Think how the writer is inviting us. Second point to ponder. The Word is a lamb. The Word is a lamb. The Word, the one, the man who existed before creation in perfect union with God, is a lamb. Again, if this doesn't blow us away, we have become way too accustomed to hearing these ideas. I know that I have. I have to force myself to stop and reflect on the full weight of what that really means, what it's really saying, that John the Baptist has told us. If we were to finish the whole chapter, he ends in verse 34. This is the witness. This is the testimony. He says, behold, I've seen him, and he is the Son of God. This is our first witness of many throughout this gospel. His official testimony in court, under oath, says, I have seen and borne witness that this is the Son of God. The Son of God, the divine Word, is a lamb. What do you do with that? Where do you go with that? How does that work together? You see, implicit in that is an invitation. Look back to chapter 1, verse 12. It says, He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. Verse 12, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. See, we all have sin. Each one of us. And our sin keeps us from God. But God has sent a lamb from heaven, his own Son, the eternal Word, who existed in all glory with the Father to come and take our sin away. He who made everything was rejected by his own creation. But to those who did not reject him, to those who receive him, he willingly takes us in and makes us children of God. If you have never considered that, if you have never taken him in, I would invite you to listen to the testimony of John the Baptist. The Word is the Lamb who can take away your sin. The testimony of John the Baptist is, I've seen him. And I'm telling you the truth under oath. He is the Son of God.